We ready? Make sure he's ready. You ready? All right, good morning, everybody. How are y'all doing today? Great. We are going to go ahead and get rolling. Thank you for joining us. This is our second in our three-part series for our education forums on the Unified Development Ordinance. A couple things for those that are watching online. The link for the PowerPoints that we're going to be discussing today for the PowerPoint slide is in the comments section under the video. There's a link there that you can access all the PowerPoint presentations. Real fast, I'd like to thank our three speakers, Caleb, Andy, and Mark, for coming out this morning and speaking with us. And so I'm going to turn it over to them. Our next and last forum is Wednesday, July the 13th from 4 to 5. So please make sure you're out at that one and tuning in on that one. So I'm going to turn this over. I guess we're starting off with Caleb, and then we'll get rolling and open it up for questions. Caleb.
Good morning. As Matt mentioned, my name is Caleb Colbert. I'm an attorney with Brown Will Brand here in town, and it's great to see so many smiling faces at 7:30 to talk about zoning regulations. So God bless you guys. We'll just jump right into this. So kind of where we are, a couple of years ago, the city hired a consultant to revise and consolidate all of the existing zoning and subdivision regulations. The consultant produced a final rough draft last fall. And so that's sort of the version that we're working off of right now. As Planning and Zoning considers this document, it is releasing updated rough drafts throughout the process. We don't have a final draft for public consideration yet. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is subject to change and comment, and we would encourage you to do that. Mark will talk a little bit more about that process momentarily. I was asked just to sort of give a brief overview of what's in the new zoning regulations, what changes are there. But that's sort of tough to give a brief overview of a document that's over 360 pages long with over 1,100 footnotes. So we're just really touching on the tip of the iceberg this morning. I would encourage everyone to get out and read the document because it is going to affect a lot of the way we do business and development in Columbia for the next 30 or 40 years. So sort of just in broad strokes, what the new zoning regulations provide for, zoning districts are modified and consolidated. The centerpiece of the new zoning regulations, of course, are the form-based regulations for downtown. There are new subdivision standards and regulations, and parking requirements are also modified. Again, these are just sort of the highlights of what we're going to hit on this morning. There are a lot of other changes included in the document. Jumping into the downtown stuff. The downtown regulations all revolve around the regulating plan. The regulating plan, you'll see, includes color-coded streets. Depending on the color on which your building is located, that color will dictate the form and design restrictions on your property. So in other words, this is sort of the guiding document for all of the rest of the design regulations. And again, this is also a document that is going through some change. In fact, at the last Planning and Zoning meeting, there was an indication that there would be some changes to the color coding of certain streets. So we're waiting on the final draft of this document, but this is the version we're working with right now. The four building form standards are Urban General West, Urban Storefront, and Townhouse Small Apartment. So for Urban General, those are all lots that front on an orange street. You have the current 2-story minimum. You have to be built up to the required building line for most of the property. The required building line is a term that is defined in the code and it's shown on the regulating plan itself. Your maximum building height is either 6 stories or 10 stories, depending on where you're located. There is a cross-hatched section of downtown. In that cross-hatched section, that's the core building height. You can be up to 10 stories tall in that area. For lots that front on an orange street that are outside of the cross-hatched area, they're limited to 6 stories in height. In addition, a new requirement in this zoning code is the requirement for public or private open area. Here it's in the Urban General, the requirement is 15% of the total buildable area has to be designated as open area. There are restrictions on the uses that are permitted on ground and upper stories. Ground stories can only be used for commercial, residential, public, or institutional purposes. Upper stories may only be used for residential or commercial purposes. Again, there's the map, generally where urban general is located. Urban storefront applies to all lots of front on a red street. Primary distinction is that the ground story use is limited to retail or food or beverage. In other words, no residential uses on the ground story. Again, it's subject to the 2-story minimum building height and either the 6 or the 10-story maximum building height. Generally, it's 10 stories based on where you'll see the red is. They're generally in the core building height area. In addition, in order to encourage an active pedestrian area along the sidewalk, you can't have shelving in front of the windows. You have to permit a view into the building to a depth of 15 feet so that pedestrians can feel like they're involved and engaged in the ground story use. So everyone asks, what are these buildings going to look like? Well, here are images from the consultant's report of what buildings in the urban general or the urban storefront area should look like. You'll see that they are relatively tall. It's dense development, built to the required building line, or essentially built to the sidewalk, and of course no 1-story buildings. Again, just to illustrate some of the different type of buildings that would be permitted under these zoning regulations. So Urban General West, this is essentially the part of downtown that's west of Providence. The building height is 1 story, obviously. The 2-story minimum doesn't apply. The maximum building height is 6 stories. On the private and public open area requirement, it is 10% of the total buildable area. Ground stories, again, can be commercial, residential, public, or institutional uses. Upper stories may only be residential or commercial. And again, here are some examples of what buildings in the Urban General West would look like. And here is a small snapshot of the regulating plan showing where that area is generally located. And again, for properties along the gold or yellow, you have 1 story, maximum building height of 6 stories, and 10% open area. Townhouse small apartment is the 4th and final building form. It has a minimum building height of 2 stories, a maximum building height of 4 stories. This is intended to be the transition to residential areas on the edge of the existing C2 zoning. And I guess I should specify, of course, the MDT district that we're talking about with the 4 building forms does take the place of the C2 zoning today. So that essentially substitutes anywhere the C2 zoning will become part of the MDT district and subject to one of these 4 building forms. Another thing to point out on the townhouse small apartment, it is generally residential. It does allow for office uses, but it does not permit commercial uses other than office. Here's an example of what buildings would be permitted in this building form. Again, primarily residential type townhouses or row houses built to the required building line. Here's just a couple of quick snapshots of where townhouse is currently shown on the regulating plan. Subdivision regulations. There are also, so we're going to kind of jump topics here. That's sort of the regulations that apply to downtown in a nutshell. Andy will talk a little bit more about the MDT district here in a minute. But there are also changes to subdivision regulations. One of the new requirements is a requirement to bring in a land analysis map with any plat. If you're going to subdivide property, you have to provide the city staff with a land analysis map that identifies any sensitive areas. Sensitive areas are outlined in the draft code, and they include such things as stream corridors, floodplains, steep slopes, habitat for endangered species, and then there's sort of this catch-all of views, cultural and or historical features, burial mounds, wildlife habitat, and wildlife corridor. a lot of those terms are not defined, so it's not clear, to me from a professional perspective, exactly what qualifies as wildlife habitat or wildlife corridor. I think this is an area where there could be a little more detail and this could be fleshed out a little bit more. But this is significant because if you have land shown on your land analysis map as a sensitive area, it has to be put in a preservation easement. You can't develop on it. You're prohibited from having a building on anything that is designated as a sensitive area. So this is a significant change, and a change that needs to be discussed and addressed in a little more detail. Columbia Imagine does include in its appendix a map of what it considers to be sensitive areas. And the sensitive areas, and you can't see it really well in this depiction, but are all the cross-hatched areas. It doesn't, not every inch of ground that is in the cross-hatched area is considered a sensitive area, but that generally depicts where you're going to find the steep slopes, soils that may not be conducive to development, so on and so forth. One thing that's interesting is on this map you can see Discovery Parkway is shown as a sensitive area, but it's also shown as an employment and a commercial district. So there will have to be some give and take between development in so-called sensitive areas and development along major highways where we expect there to be development. There are also a few other changes that I don't have on slides as far as subdivision regulations. For example, subdivision plats are now only good for 2 years instead of the current requirement. In other words, you have to begin construction after having a plat approved within 2 years, or you'll have to go through the process again. You also have reduced cul-de-sac length, and the number of dwelling units that you can have off of a single street access has been reduced from 100 to 30. So that would require a lot, substantially more street accesses in subdivisions. Parking is also something that's been affected. Of course, we deal with parking we break it down in 2 ways: parking in the downtown area and parking everywhere else. So we'll start with sort of the parking downtown and the existing C2 in the proposed MDT district. There are no parking minimums except for residential uses. The minimum parking for residential uses is a quarter space per bedroom. It can be provided on site or within half a mile of the site. This carries forward the existing parking requirements. There is a maximum cap on parking. Essentially, it's tied to what parking would be permitted outside of downtown at whatever that number is. Take that times 125%, and that's your cap on parking. There are also, of course, bicycle parking requirements for the MDT district. Everywhere else, parking is generally reduced. I think the consultant's view was that business owners ought to be able to make their own determination as to how much parking they need to serve their customers. And so, generally speaking, retail, restaurants, all that sort of stuff, the parking requirements are reduced. The minimum parking requirements are increased for fraternity and sororities. Again, you can satisfy, and this is an existing ordinance, you can satisfy your minimum off-street parking requirements through shared parking with other business owners that are in the area. One new addition is that you can satisfy your parking requirements with the use of public spaces. So parking garages on street. It could be, if you can show that there's a surplus of parking, you could use those to satisfy your parking requirements. Again, the parking maximum I mentioned earlier, it also applies to certain buildings outside of the downtown area. Another question that is raised is, well, we have a lot of one-story buildings downtown, so we're going to have a lot of non-conforming structures. How are properties going to be grandfathered in, essentially? And the UDO breaks it down into non-conforming buildings and non-conforming uses. Non-conforming buildings, you can continue to use them, you can continue to occupy them. The consultant we haven't gotten to this portion of the code in the planning and zoning process. So we don't have the final draft of what staff is going to present to the Planning and Zoning Commission. But the consultant did agree that a non-conforming building could be expanded by 25% as long as it doesn't make a non-conformity worse. He also agreed that one-story buildings could have a one-story addition. Again, we don't have this in a black and white draft ordinance yet, but that is the indication we've been given from the consultant. For residential buildings, if they're damaged, they can be rebuilt as they were. For mixed use or non-residential buildings, if the damage exceeds 75% of the building value, excluding the foundation, they have to be rebuilt in compliance with the code. Non-conforming uses, again, this deals with what you're doing inside of the building itself. You can continue in non-conforming use, but if you stop it for a period of 12 months, you will lose the right to continue that non-conforming use. If you switch to conforming use, you can't go back. So here, let me give you a quick example of uses that will be impacted. So today you can have a restaurant in an M1 property, in industrial property. In the new code, they've removed the restaurant use from the ID or IG, the industrial district, to make the industrial district more of a special purpose district. Well, so if you have a restaurant there today and the code is adopted, that use is non-conforming in that district. If you stop the restaurant use for a period of 12 months, you can't restart it without going through the administrative process to get permission. If you switch to an industrial use, you can't go back to the restaurant use. So those are that's just sort of a rough example of how that would impact business owners in one situation. Non-conforming uses can be expanded throughout the building. Again, with the restaurant use, if you're only using part of a warehouse for a restaurant use in an industrial district today, you can expand the restaurant use throughout the building. If your building conforms, you can expand your non-conforming use by 25%. I think that is the zoning code in a nutshell.
So thanks, Caleb does an outstanding job of doing the overview of these things, including the downtown. My presentation is going to focus entirely on downtown. I'm on the downtown CID board, and we've been following this zoning change very carefully because this is going to have a huge impact on downtown. Probably downtown's going to be, as impacted certainly, but probably more impacted than any place else downtown. It's a radical change, not necessarily a horrible or unnecessary change, just it's a entirely different way of doing zoning, certainly downtown. So on the CID board, we kind of looking around at each other and recognizing that we're not experts in urban planning and design, so we felt ill-equipped to really evaluate the changes to the extent we thought necessary. So we hired a consultant to evaluate the changes for us. The company is Winter & Company. They're based in Boulder, Colorado. We're familiar with them. They did a set of voluntary design guidelines for downtown. And they're very they're well known in the industry nationwide. They work across the country. We were comfortable with them, have a lot of respect for them. They were familiar with Columbia, so we thought it was a perfect fit. We gave them a set of tasks. First, we wanted them to identify a number of lots downtown that would be representative of other lots in the downtown area, and then design quality projects on each lot and apply the new development code. Their mission was to identify any unintended consequences that came out of the application of the code on those projects. And then we asked them to make some recommendations based on their findings. And they also were doing some economic modeling as part of this process. The city did some testing of their code. From the beginning, we on the CID board were asking the city, what kind of code testing are you going to do? And they did have a little bit built into their consultant agreement with Clarion Associates, which came up with this plan. But it was very limited, and they said that from the get-go. They were very honest and open about the fact that they didn't have a lot of budget available for doing extensive testing. So we wanted to we felt like it was important to do some more testing, so that's why we decided to hire Wintering Company. We did this in partnership with the Columbia Board of Realtors and Last Enterprises. They wound up with 6 test sites, and these ranged from full block residential developments all the way down to a very small addition to a building that had been an adaptive reuse project. And what they found was that the code is not bad. It does represent sound principles of city planning and urban design. It does enhance the public realm by promoting new development with a strongly defined street edge that's pedestrian friendly. The development that the code encourages does reduce the visual and physical impact of cars, which was an objective of the code rewrite for downtown, and it does discourage uses that are less urban in character. However, they found some room for improvement. Some of the standards they found difficult to interpret, and these are professionals. See, this is what these folks do for a living. And as they were applying the code, they had a lot of questions about what the intent was in the language, and they would ask the city staff for clarification. And a lot of times the city staff didn't really have a good answer. You know, they were trying to learn the code at the same time. So the consultants did identify a need to clarify certain aspects of the code. They believed that the code needed more flexibility to meet some of the standards, and we'll get into that in a minute. And they found that some of the standards just might not be reasonable to apply, especially for small properties. I guess one of the big picture takeaways that they came out of this exercise with was that the code actually does pretty well with handling large projects. But smaller projects might have trouble meeting some of the standards. And that's primarily because with a large project, you can spread out the costs of complying with some of these requirements over a lot of square footage, a lot of lot area. But with a small project, you have a limited ability to do those costs. So on a percentage basis, it just becomes more of a significant part of the overall project. Some of the areas they found to be problematic, particularly for small projects, were the landscaping and open space requirements. The open space requirement, they found in some cases would create gaps on a lot that really didn't lend a whole lot to the public realm and might prevent efficient use of the lot, which could increase development risk and make it just a little less likely that the building owner or the property owner would proceed with the project. Parking, they really only found structured parking to be feasible for very large projects, and they did some break-even analysis and determined that to be a project with about 80 units or more. And they found that parking minimums tend to reduce downtown density by creating surface lots. Some of the glazing standards and building facade articulation they determined might be difficult for small projects to meet. There's a requirement of building articulation once every 50 feet on a facade, and they figured that about a 30% ratio of glazing for a project to meet the new code. They did recommend a couple of places in their analysis that an exemption for smaller properties might be appropriate, and they zeroed in on about a quarter block as the size of the project that would be, maybe above that would be able to meet these standards with no difficulty. Street walls and parking setbacks. There were some issues they found with street walls. The street walls are intended to lessen the deadening effect that large open spaces can have on the the public realm. You don't want to walk past a large open surface parking lot, for example. However, their application in the code, the consultants at Winter & Company found to be a little strange in some cases. For example, if you have a large project that doesn't cover the an entire block. This was an example. An example of a entire city block that they tested as a generic test case. They figured out that you could meet all the open space requirements and the parking requirement and the parking setback requirement with this configuration of building footprint, but that would create a huge stretch of street edge that, according to the code, would require a 5 to 12 foot masonry wall. And they were kind of scratching their heads trying to figure out how that would be an improvement for pedestrians. Another thing that the code creates is a little bit of a no man's land in here behind this street wall and in front of the parking setback. There's a 24-foot parking setback that's in the code, so you can't have any parking ahead of that line. But you also can't count that space between that line and the sidewalk as open space. So there was a little bit of confusion about what exactly would become of that space, and the consultants were concerned that without allowing that to be used as open space, it might just become pavement, just something that wouldn't really contribute to the project at all in any meaningful way. Okay, we'll get into some of the specific projects that they designed that highlighted some of the other aspects of the plan that they found issue with. And bear in mind now that I'm only talking about the challenging aspects of the code that they identified. There are a lot of aspects of the code that they thought were worthwhile, but they were asked to find unintended consequences of the code so that we could have a chance of fixing this before we adopted the code into ordinance. The open area requirement for small sites was a problem in their opinion. The draft code sets the same minimum percentage for open area for all projects within the total buildable area of the lot, and 2/3 of that open space has to be met at grade. So there is a provision for offering some of the open space above grade on balconies or the rooftop, for example, but only 33% of that of the requirement can be met that way. So in a quarter block development that they did on Broadway, this is one of the sites that they identified. This is where Tropical Liqueurs is now. They did a hypothetical 5-story office building and figured out that to create the open space that's required in the code, they would have to notch out the building, and it would likely be in the back of the building and hidden by a street wall. And so there was some question as to what public benefit that had when you were configuring the building that way. And there was even a question about how beneficial that would be to the users of the building. They did question at some time, on numerous occasions, why it wasn't possible to meet the 100% of the requirement on the roof, for example, in projects like this. The required building line popped up as an issue with the small building addition. This is the Cafe Berlin site. They looked at this site as a test case for what would happen if the property owner wanted to do a small addition to a building, in this case, that was set back at the rear of the lot, and was a 1-story building. Let's say the tenant needed some back office, some back of the house space, maybe expand the dining room, rather than do an addition out to the side, which might be logical. The code would require that addition to come to the required building line along the street. So you would wind up with what would be, potentially an awkward addition to this building to bring it out to the street edge. Ironically, in this case, it covers up the open space on the lot also. So another question about how this code would be applied is whether an addition this size, if it's 25% or more of the building footprint, would require the building to come into conformity. That might require a second story on this building. But then the other question is, well, what about the rest of the lot? Does that also trigger the rest of the lot to come into conformity with the code? And if that were the case, then again, you would have a street wall along 10th and Park, and you would probably lose much of the parking on the lot because of the parking setback. So they did recommend some changes to the code that would allow this kind of a project by right. Numerous times throughout the analysis, they pointed out that you can go for an administrative review and probably get it in a case like this because some of these changes just don't make sense. But their question was, why do you have to do that? Why not just create the code with enough flexibility to allow this sort of project to proceed? They were concerned about adaptive reuse and small additions to buildings. And we're kind of had a keen eye to making sure that there was nothing in the code that was going to prevent downtown from developing incrementally, as opposed to just wholesale clearing of lots and construction of large projects. We've had a lot of that. It seems like that's what a lot of people are concerned about. And they were trying to determine whether there's anything in the code that would encourage that sort of an outcome. And they did raise that as a concern, that it's possible that if you make it too difficult to do an incremental improvement to your building, the owner of the lot is just going to say, well, I'm left with no choice but to wait around until a large student housing apartment developer comes along and sell out with a bunch of my neighbors, and we'll get a large project that can handle the code pretty well. And to be fair, the code does handle those large projects pretty well. It does make the buildings look nice, and it doesn't add a whole lot of cost to the project in any kind of a significant way. Historic properties was something that the CID is concerned about. We have a historic preservationist on the board. Deb Shields has been doing this for 20 years. This was not something that was that came directly out of the Winter and Company report, but it is something that's kind of come up in our conversations with them. Is what do we do if we have a historic property downtown and the owner wants to add on to it? The Niedermeyer's is one that we've used as an example. If the Niedermeyer wanted to do an addition to this building, historic preservation principles would require that addition to be in the back. The new code, if it's larger than 25% of the footprint, would require that to be in the front, and it would probably require a street wall to be built around it. And that would seriously jeopardize its ability to meet the standards that would allow it to remain on the National Register of Historic Places. Here's another example of how the street wall is problematic. One point that the consultants raised was that this could be a safety risk. There is a provision for allowing gaps in the wall for parking access. This is something that people could hide behind. So that was a concern. The design criteria for the wall is unclear. The code actually says that it requires a masonry wall. It does say that it has to be 5 to 12 feet tall. So it appears that under the code, the wall that's at 6th and Broadway outside the law firm there is what the code envisions street walls to be. Some people find that an unattractive corner, whereas the use of fencing that Landmark Bank has done at their building downtown would not be allowed under the code. You know, this is an ornate fence. It's beautiful. It's a piece of artwork, really. And this is not something that would be allowed under the code. The consultants were asking for a little bit of flexibility, or recommending that some flexibility be added to allow this sort of design feature rather than a blank street wall. Here's another example of a full block residential project that they tried to create, and that would create huge stretches of street wall along surface parking, if that was the type of parking they used to meet the requirement. So as a result of all of this testing that Wintering Company did, the CID did come up with some requests that the board made to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and that was to exempt small projects, those a quarter block or less, from some of the standards, not all, and also exempt additions that didn't result in a building footprint that took up 75% of a parcel. An example of that might be Broadway Diner. If they were to do an addition to their small building that was 25% or more, it would still be a small building, but it would also trigger a street wall around that giant lot, which would probably not be beneficial to the public in any meaningful way. And also, the CID asked for exemption for properties on the National Register of Historic Places. Billiards on Broadway gets used as an example of a historic building that might have difficulty doing an addition. There is room in the back to do an addition of 25% of their building. And if they did that, they might be required to build a second story on their lot, which would really change the character of the building and probably make it ineligible as a contributing building to the historic district downtown. So these are just some of the issues that have been raised as concerns in this study. Here's an example of how the open space requirement might make it difficult to develop on a small lot downtown. This is the Alpine Shop building. And in order to get if the owner wanted to do a 4-story addition to that building and meet the open space requirement with 2/3 of it at grade level, it would require the building to be notched out in this fashion, which is not really an efficient use of the space on that lot. And this might be a case where meeting that requirement on the roof might make more sense. That's really it. You know, if there are 3 key takeaways from this testing that Wintering Company did, one of them is the impact that this code has on small lots. I talked a little bit about this at the P&Z Commission meeting last week, and it appears that there's a little bit of a conflict between 2 worthwhile objectives of the code rewrite. One is the desire for more density, and one is the desire for historic preservation. You can't always have both of them at the same time, and it appears that this code does favor density over historic preservation. And the concern, again, is that there are aspects of the code that might make it problematic for small lot owners to do incremental improvement to their lot, and then would decide instead that it makes sense to sell to a larger owner to do a big project. The street wall requirements, could pose a safety risk and might not be in keeping with the character of downtown that we want here. And then there was some clarification of the standards that was necessary as the Winter & Company consultants went through their process. And many of those examples are listed in their report, which is available on the CID website. And if anybody wants a copy of that, I'm sure Matt at the Chamber could get that to you, or I could too. So please feel free to reach out anytime, and thanks for your time. I'm going to kick it over to Mark Farnan. He's going to tell us
what to do with them.
That's right. Keep this process moving forward.
People tell me what to do with it all the time. My name is Mark Farnan. I'm with Strategist Communications here in town. People ask me, what do I do? Despite my attire today, I'm not a Catholic priest. We do a lot of government relations, public relations, research, analysis, and different kinds of representation. And a lot of people offhandedly always say, oh, he's one of those guys who goes down there and fights with City Hall all the time. That's not true. Most of the time, when we do our job and do it well, we work with City Hall, and we work with the city staff. We work with a whole bunch of different neighborhood groups and people in the community who have a good idea. And we implement those good ideas the best that we can. And that's what, do you remember G.I. Joe, that little toy, G.I. Joe? When they made a movie about G.I. Joe, he got a motto, like Boy Scouts are being prepared. G.I. Joe's motto is, knowing is half the battle. Okay, so these guys are the first half. These guys have knowledge. And then I am going to try and help you decide what to do with that knowledge this morning. We call this zeroing in on zoning, and I want to talk about the process. They've talked a lot about the details of the code. The process, you will hear from a lot of people, oh, this is not a new deal. We've been working on this for 2 years, oh, maybe even longer than that. The predicate to this, what really happened a long time ago was we had so much downtown building and so much more on the horizon, and a lot of it was student housing. A lot of people became afraid of that and thought, this is too much, too fast. And so they asked for an interim zoning code to be adopted, and we call it the C2 interim. It only affected downtown. It didn't affect the rest of the community. But it put some limitations in place, parking and building heights and those sort of things, so that people could step back, take a breath, and then do something else. That C2 zoning code was adopted in 2014. Shortly after that, the decision was made to hire a consultant to rewrite the entire code, not just the downtown part, but the code for the whole town. And that was supposed to have been done by December of 2015. But it is this is a massive job. I think Caleb referred to it, 300 pages, 300 plus pages, more than 1,100 footnotes and column notations. It's huge, and so we went through a big process for 2 years, basically. What they did at that point, and there's a difference between what they did then and what they did now. What they did then is the consultant would come in and he would meet with several different stakeholder groups, and that could mean people from a particular neighborhood, it could mean a group of builders, it could be people who own property in the downtown area, or individual homeowners or bankers. And they solicited input, and there was a real back and forth. Like, you sit there, and you could sit there for an hour or 2 hours with these guys, and you could argue about the finer points of what should be included and shouldn't be included. Then they took all that information back and put it into this massive code and said, here's how they write it in some other communities, and here's how we think you should write it there, taking into account some of the things that we heard, because some of the things they heard weren't included. So they issued a report in October 2015, which was the initial draft Unified Development Ordinance. So you'll see UDO or UDC sometimes. We always think of it it's the zoning code. If you see UDO, that's Unified Development Ordinance. So people took a look at that and said, we're still not quite happy with this. So they sent in more suggestions, primarily to the city staff and to the consultant. And Clarion and Associates and Farrellman came back with yet another update. And it was let's call it the amendment sheet. It was additional information that they saw after the 2015 version of the draft UDO was made. It said, we're still not sure about some of this stuff, so let's weave this into the code. In May of this year, they came out with the first half of the updated code, which included staff notes, and included all of the footnotes that highlight what is being changed as you go forward. So we talked about the unified, in May of this year. That's right, okay, I'm on track. Since that time in May, that was the first half, about 160 pages, and it covered some of the topics in the code. Since that time, there have been 3 more sections that have come out that have been added on to that, and you're probably going to get 1 or 2 more. And then you will have the whole revised draft UDO. And that is what is going to be voted on, or amended, or debated, and that process has started now. If you would like to get a copy of that, you've got to get all the parts of it. And you can on the city's website, which if you go, this is what it'll look like, and this is where you will see your information, and it'll have all of the different little parts to it. And the easiest way to find it on the city's website is go to como.gov. That's the city's new website address, como.gov, and just type in the search box, zoning code project planning, and this will be your first hit. That's what comes up. There's a different way to get there, but that's the easiest way. Zoning code planning, and this will come up. And now what it will show you is all these different parts. There's the main part, the 160 pages, that was first in May. And then there will be some additional chapters. You have to get all those to know what you're really working with. Also on that page, there is a new item, and this is something that is going to be very helpful to people as they navigate this. The Planning and Zoning Commission has held 4 hearings now, and during those hearings, people have got up and given testimony, or they have sent in letters, or they have sent in ideas or proposals for changes, or even just questions sometimes. We started a process of trying to capture those and then talk to city staff and said, isn't there a way that we can do this better? Because we don't know where we are in the process. And we don't know if any of these questions that we've brought up are going to be remembered by the end of the process. And we're afraid if we don't argue about it now that they're just going to be gone. And we've got to do this a better way. And city staff agreed. And so did Planning and Zoning. And they said, let's catalog this in an efficient manner. And they have started a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet has 5 sections, basically. And at first, it identifies any question that has been brought up at Planning and Zoning. And it could be a smart question, it could be a stupid question, but they got it. And they put it in there. Well, I mean, sometimes that is absolutely true. I've been criticized for maybe going off topic before. But there's that. Then there is a section that says, here is the citation. This is the part of the code that this really deals with, because sometimes that's a difficult thing to talk about. This is 300, 400 pages long, and you can say, and I'll give you an example about this in a minute, well, that's that part about the funeral homes. Well, what? So you go to section 29-4.1, that little I, little c, little I, or whatever, and then you'll find that. But they have put now where that is in the code. Then there is a slight discussion, a short discussion, and it says, here was what our initial answer was to that question that was posed. And that is generated, that's been generated by city staff. Then there's a little box that says, did we answer the question fully? And it has a Y or a N, yes or no. And sometimes they answered it, but they didn't think it was the full answer, or it still bears merits some discussion, and they put a no there. And then they'll put what we might want to look at. If we put no, what we might want to look at, or they might say, we took care of that, don't worry about it anymore. One of the questions was, can we please get a map that is big enough for us to read? City staff said, yes, so it has a Y. They told them that, yes, we'll do that, and then that's done. So we get rid of that. But right now, there are more than 100 different issues that have been brought up in these 4 meetings, more than 100. And I'm sending in about 22 more this week because I watched the last meeting. And at that meeting, we took that, and so we're going to make sure that the city staff has those items, and they're doing the same thing. And so we could be at 125, 150 different issues that have to be dealt with before anyone can have confidence that this code is good. That's where it's important for you. I'm assuming that anybody who would come here at 7:30 in the morning with no donuts and no coffee, that if you came here, you have an opinion about something in this code or some question about the process, and this is the time to get involved in it. I'm going to talk about the timeline for it in a few minutes, but that's the thing. You have to do this now. So, how can you have input? Here's the bad news. If knowledge is half the battle, reading the code is the other half. And this is a massive tome. This is impossible to do. But if you want to be intelligent in your presentation, you have to read it. And and a lot of people have started and tried, and they have not gotten all the way through it. These two guys I know have both. Some people in our audience who have the responsibility to make judgments about this have. It is a difficult read, but there are some things in here, and you think you know what you're looking for, but there are some things in here, and these are the ones that will kill you. The ones that you didn't know were in there that could have a significant effect on you. So the first thing you have to do is read it, at least read it the best you can, or follow, even just go get that worksheet that brings up the primary questions and gives the code citation. Get that and download that from the city website, and it may give you it's kind of like a Cliff's Notes to the zoning code. It will help you walk through that and look at things that other people think are important and that you can address. Then I say make short notes. That's kind of what is being done with this spreadsheet that is now available and that we encourage them to do. But we even came up with a little way to do this. And it's just a little form, and it's a little format, and it's very simple, and you can do any issue just about in one page. And all it does is it creates a decision-making matrix. This is the same thing they use at DuPont whenever they decide on a multi-million-dollar project. This is the exact same thing except boiled down to city council level. And it gives an issue statement. I did one, and I'm going to use this as an example, and I'll give anybody who wants this a copy, but it's very simple. I did one about funeral homes. And it's not because I work for the funeral industry, or it's not because I'm being paid by Millard Family Funeral Homes, anything like that. It's because I used to live upstairs at a funeral home in Mexico, Missouri. Firebird and Saddle Horse, capital of the world. the whole deal. I'd lived upstairs at one. And what I noticed as I read through the code was that there was a section and it said, special citation, special use, funeral home or mortuary, section 29.3-3. It says that this use is subject to the following standards. The use shall be conducted within a fully enclosed, legally permitted structure. That seems like an innocuous comment, and that might be in any zoning code anywhere in America. But the problem is that most funeral homes are not fully enclosed structures. Most of them have a portico that comes out to the side. kind of makes some of them look like a drive-in bank. The reason they do that is so that when they take the casket out of the funeral home and they put it in the hearse, and we have bad Missouri weather, that there's a covered place that is out of respect to the deceased and for the convenience of the family and the pallbearers who are there. That wouldn't comply with code because it's not a fully enclosed structure. But it's right. It's the way we should do it. And it's the way everybody else does it. So why is that in there? Nobody knows. So I asked the staff about it, and the staff said, it makes sense to me. And so I turned in one of these. And I said, this is the problem with it. This is what's happening here. There's the rationale for this. Other factors, the construction of funeral homes with overhangs or covered driveways is ordinary and frequent in many parts of the United States, including Missouri. It's not confrontational, it just states the facts. We turned it in, and if you look at that spreadsheet that they've done now, then it said, some guy got up and talked about a funeral home. They said what section of the code it was, because I signified exactly which part. They said, we said we didn't know. Has this been answered? No. But the thing at the very end then says, but we should just get rid of that. We can just get rid of that. Okay, that's an easy one. But it is the way that you can be most effective. The best way to do this is not go down there and scream at everybody. Even if you're angry about something, don't go down and scream at it. Don't go down and scream at P&Z guys. They didn't write one line of this code. Don't go scream at city staff. They're interpreting what they were handed, and they're doing the best that they can, and they are busy. And they're frustrated with this too because there are some things that are contradictory. Now, I'm not saying don't be passionate about it, but start with something like this. Get the really easy piece. This does half the work right here. It takes a long time, and this will take you a little time just to go through and be thoughtful and get your thoughts in there, and then find a citation, and then give a real rationale. Then take that and do one or two things with it. Send it in. And you can send it right now. The appropriate time is to send it to planning and zoning. And send it to city staff simultaneously because they will track this. Planning and zoning will see it. And it becomes a part of the record for discussion. And that discussion will continue to occur up until until City Council makes final disposition on this thing. This will be a part of that record. Send that in. Use this as your template. But that's not going to satisfy some of you because you've got upset 30 down here. You've got something else that's bugging you. So send a fiery letter with it. Put the thing, all the rest of the stuff in there. This is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And don't insult anybody individually, but then put all that in there. But do this so it's easy for them to track. Or do this. Show up at one of these planning and zoning meetings. There are some that are still coming up. There are still some more planning and zoning hearings that will be held, and you do have an opportunity to talk about just about anything you want. And planning and zoning, frankly, has been pretty good about allowing time, a little bit of interchange and give and take between staff or the commissioners and somebody who's coming. But typically you take about 3 to 5 minutes. So use this as your outline. Fill this thing out before you go, send it in, and if you feel like you really need to go down there and talk about it, take this. If you use this as your outline, it'll be about 3 to 5 minutes and you will make perfect sense. And it will be clear to the people, and it will be a good piece in the record for anybody else to follow. So I'm encouraging people to do that. I want to talk a little bit about the timeline. We have talked about that this was supposed to be done by December 31st of 2015. So there's not a date certain that this is going to happen by. We've already passed that. So now we are in a situation where we have just an enormous volume of information. And as these two presented, there are a lot of questions and a lot of conflicting things within that code that have to be resolved before anybody's going to sign their name on it in good conscience. And there are a lot of competing points of view. There are some people who feel very strongly about the same thing on two different sides. There are also now at least 2 task forces that have been charged with weighing in on what they believe should be included in this Unified Development Ordinance. One of them is the Mayor's Task Force on Infrastructure, and they're behind in their work. They were supposed to be wrapped up about now, and they're still having regular hearings on how the infrastructure pieces of the Unified Development Ordinance should be dealt with, both in the downtown area and at large. So they're running behind. There's also a parking task force that has been nominated and appointed, and that parking task force didn't get appointed until Monday of last week. They have not had their first meeting. But if you look at the timeline, whoops, sorry about that. That's something out. There it is. There's the schedule. July 7th is our next meeting. That will be about the same night as the first parking ordinance task force meeting. The topic for July 7th is new parking, landscaping, screening, exterior lighting, which is what that task force is supposed to weigh in on. They can't possibly have their stuff ready by then. And everybody sees that. That's not even a topic of debate. So they have tried to work, and the city staff's tried to coordinate between the commission, the city council, and the task force to see when they could do it. And at the last planning and zoning meeting, planning and zoning suggested that there be some level of additional time granted to be able to fully vet this, to give the task forces time to get their information in, and to have more credible, thoughtful debate about some of these topics where there are very apparent conflicts. So we know now that the commission has sent the city council a note that suggests that there needs to be at least 2 more months in this time frame. So this is going to change a little bit, most likely. The Planning and Zoning Commission will continue to have hearings, as they have indicated. It also appears that they're going to have additional work sessions to discuss these issues. If you go to a work session, you can. They're all public, but you don't get to talk there. That's not the place to do it. Go to one of the hearings if you want to talk. If you feel intimidated or afraid, and not very many people in this room, I can tell, feel that way. And if you do, then just send it in. It's okay. It will become a part of the record, and they're doing a good job at keeping track of it. But make sure that you get your opinion known and make it thoughtful. That's about how the process has gone. There is no minimum time period. I do have copies of this sheet in case you just want to see how I did it. You're not bound by that, but it just helps you think through the process of doing it. And then if you can remember everything that Andy and Caleb said, just write all that down in there and we'll be fine. And if you forget, call us or ask us questions now, because I think it's question and answer, isn't it? Is that what we're supposed to do?
We'll do question and answer.
Yes, okay.
Mark, I have a question about the process. If you attend one of the planning and zoning meetings,
Yes.
and the topic that night is parking or signage,
Yeah.
but you missed the one about stormwater regulations that you found out post-meeting that affects you greatly, can you talk about the stormwater from
Yeah.
planning and zoning that night, or does it
Yeah.
have to stick to subject?
No, they've been really good about that. In fact, at any of the meetings, they basically, the reason that they assign topics to the different sessions was to kind of give it some order. And a good example was last week was the hearing that was supposed to be mostly about the MDT, the downtown zoning. I said at the earlier one of these meetings, that was like wristband night at the Boone County Fair. That's when everybody wanted to go. And it was a good turnout, and it was And it was intended to, so we could focus mostly on that. So most of the people there. But from day one on this, if I wanted to talk about MDT in the very first meeting, I could. If I wanted to talk about funeral homes at any of these meetings, they are cool with letting you do that, and they encourage it because here's another good reason why. The downtown CID did some code testing, and the code testing did focus a lot on the MDT, but it brought up issues that could pertain to anything in that code. That code testing wasn't done until June 15th, and then not published until about June 15th, right in there. You couldn't have talked about it at the first one, even if it had been scheduled. So they've been really good about that, and they've been really good about not holding you to this 3 to 5 minute timeline. If you've got something to say, they're going to let you say it. And if you've got a topic, it should be well thought out, but it can be about anything you want any day that they do it. But if you go to planning, if you go to work session, you don't get to talk at all. That's the they talk.
Well, we can attend.
You can attend, and you can listen, and you can take notes. Those aren't televised, and the minutes don't come out till way later, and they're not all verbatim at the work session. They are at the other, but so you've got to, plan the deal, and if you can't get there in person, do it in writing, because it does become a part of the record, and they do read it. Everybody reads it. Staff reads it, council reads it, commissioners read it, I read it.
And that's the same if a commissioner, a planning and zoning commissioner, asks for a clarification of the code, and it's pretty significant clarification. That's part of the record and will get put into the system.
It does.
It does, because there were a couple of big clarifications, so I didn't know if I should submit one of those sheets so it becomes a written record, but it sounds
You should.
Go ahead and do it.
You should, and here's why. Because that also becomes a record of how much this is seems to be of importance to people in the community. And it also becomes a record of which stakeholders is this important to. And that is an important thing. So yes, go ahead and do that. It doesn't matter. Right now, there are a few that are kind of duplicates of each other in there. There are a lot of people who are asking about second stories, street wall stuff, and the questions have been asked in different ways. Sometimes the different way it's asked is as important as the basic question itself, because the basic question may not have the nuance that is needed. And so write it and be thoughtful and clear, and go ahead and turn it in writing. You don't have to waste everybody's time by running down there and hollering, but you can.
And I have one last comment. I have found on the agenda for planning and zoning, there's the staff report to them. I found that a good kind of cliff notes help because of this 300-page document to read and sit down with. I found that helpful to prepare for.
That is a very good point, and I'm going to give you one more little bonus here. This is like bonus day. Not only can you get that staff report in advance of the meeting, usually about 3 days in advance of the planning and zoning hearing, and that's published, and that is published in the meetings section, not in the section I showed you up here. You go to como.gov, go to meetings, click on planning and zoning, regular session, 6 o'clock, not the 5:30 work session, and it'll show you agenda. Then it won't come right up on your screen, depending if you're running Windows 10 or what. Sometimes it just secretly downloads in the back, and you got to go to documents and dig it out. But okay, so now you have it. The links are live. In there is a thing called staff report. Guess what else you can get now? As of yesterday, you can go to, this is bonus day. As of yesterday, you can now go to the city's website, to the other part that I showed you, where there's all these things with the different parts of the code, and they will have posted the PowerPoint that the city staff gives at those meetings after the fact, after they give it. So you can go read their staff report in advance first, then they'll give that PowerPoint. Now they're posting those online as of yesterday. And you can go back and capture. So if you didn't get you didn't get the 3D in the immersive movie theater version of it by watching it live, you can get it post.
Any other questions?
I'll just make a statement. I can't speak for Mrs. Russell, but from the Planning and Zoning Commission, we do definitely appreciate your guys' involvement in this. There's been a lot of questions raised, like the funeral home example, that we, after reading so many pages, you just kind of go blank after a while, and it's good for us to hear these comments and input from you guys as well as just the average citizen. So it helps us understand also the code, because it is a very complex, difficult document to read. So I do thank you guys for doing that, and you three have also been, I think, to every one of our meetings. So we appreciate that, and it actually has been a very good business turnout, I think, for the most part in our P&Z meetings, and so it's been good that we are being supportive from a business standpoint.
Thank you. We have found that there are a lot of people who are community activists, community leaders, and they have appreciated the fact that we tried to put a thoughtful face on this as well. Nobody's afraid of the discussion in this town. In fact, if we weren't fighting on something, this wouldn't be Columbia. But they have been very appreciative, and people who are representatives of the League of Women Voters, people who are members of the City Council, people who are community leaders, have come to these very meetings and said, we think this is a good way to go about this, and they appreciate it. But do be fiery. Write the nice thing here, and then put that fiery letter in there. Let them know what you think. It's okay.
I'd like to echo that, but my opinion is the written forms that you're sending in, if it's not important enough for you to actually thoughtfully write something, it really won't appear important. For you to write it and come speak in front of the commission, it really puts an emphasis on it. And we all have our own separate files, the spreadsheet, and it's like we're back in college again. So.
How do you think the class attendance has been at the council? Because you're encouraging people to come to the hearings. I tend to think that the class attendance has been poor so far. I don't think as many people have showed up as I expected to.
I expected to see SRO.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been that.
They're all week that last meeting, and we'll be there all night.
Yeah, but we'll be there a lot.
And
it'll be too late.
There's a part of this, and I said, you got to read the whole code to know what's going to completely happen to you. I think that it's intimidating, and I think people don't want to jump up there and appear to be foolish, and say, I think that we ought to be able to have goats on the rooftops, and then somebody from the staff or somebody will go, we're not even talking about that in the zoning code. Oh, okay, sorry. People don't want to look stupid, and I think that that's a part of the fear. Is this is such a massive thing of knowledge that it is hard to get your hands wrapped around it. And I think these guys have done a really good job. I think Downtown CID did a good job of doing that. There was a cost analysis for the first time on what this was going to be. That we talk about these things, this would be good for the public realm, and I love this, that we would have this, that whatever you can do and can't do, but we never ask the question, what does this cost? Well, now we've got a little bit of that data in there, and I think that's important. Or there's contradictions in it, and Caleb has done a good job at weeding through this and saying, well, this says this, and this says this. This says this is a sensitive area in the map that they want you to use, but this says this is also an employment district and has 15 buildings already built on it. Which one's right? Well, one of them is, and one of them's not. And that's why we got to debate this stuff. And Lee says go down there and holler at them.
I didn't say holler.
Okay.
Be respectful.
Any more questions? Well, first of all, thank everybody for coming here. I appreciate it. And everybody who joined us online, thank you. A couple reminders real fast. The final education forum that we're going to have is July the 13th from 4 to 5 p.m. We'll hold it here. We'll also broadcast it again online. Just as a reminder, the PowerPoints are available. The link is in the comment section under the video on the Tribune's website. a very special thank you to our three presenters today, and appreciate everything you are doing to help out with this for the community as a whole. So thank you, and a very special thank you to the Columbia Tribune for hosting this and broadcasting this online for us. So with that, we're wrapped up, and appreciate you being here. Thank you. Good job. Thank you. How did you go somewhere? Yeah, I'm in the